So good evening, graduate UNSY students. First, just for everybody's awareness, we are recording this session and a copy is going to be made available for those who are unable to attend live. Next, I'm going to start by introducing our guest, who's going to discuss his connection to uncrewed and autonomous systems within the aviation domain. After, I'm going to lead us through a series of questions, which will then open up the session to a larger class-wide Q&A. I do ask that everyone mutes their mics, save any questions to the end, and that you use the hand raise icon to indicate when you do have a question so I can call on you in order. With that, I am just thrilled to welcome you to the 32nd session of the UNSY Guest Speaker Series. This is the second of 3 for this term. I'm Dr. Brent Terwilliger, the program coordinator for the Master of Science in Uncrewed and Autonomous Systems degree here at Embry-Riddle Worldwide. Tonight, we're joined by our guest subject matter expert, Frederic Malaud. Frederik serves as Chief Remote Piloted Aircraft Systems at the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, which is based in Montreal, Canada. The RPAS section is responsible for ICAO's work in the areas of RPAS, Unmanned Aircraft Systems, or UAS, UAS Traffic Management, or UTM, and Advanced Air Mobility, AAM. Frederik has broad experience in international aviation regulation and multilateral policymaking, having served since 2009 as a senior official with ICAO, the United Nations specialized agency that was established by states in 1944 to manage the administration and governance of the Convention on International Civil Aviation from the Chicago Convention. As secretary of the ICAO RPAS panel, he works with the organization's 193 member states and industry groups to facilitate consensus on international standards and procedures in support of a safe, efficient, secure, economically sustainable, and environmentally responsible civil aviation sector. ICAO's regulatory activities are a key enabler to more than 100,000 flights that take place worldwide on a daily basis, and directly support the safe integration of RPAS and other unmanned aircraft, commonly referred to as drones, into the aviation system. Admitted to the bar as an attorney in the state of New York, September 1994, and as an advocate of the Paris Courts of Appeal in May 1995, Frederik has spent over a decade providing regulatory advice to major clients and assisting them in the completion of various cross-border transactions. He was appointed in 2001 as a partner with Richards Butler, an international transportation law firm based in London. He holds a master's degree in law and a master's degree in Anglo-American legal studies from the University of Paris. A licensed professional pilot and flight instructor with several years of passenger transport experience in a wide variety of operations, Frederik has acquired in-depth expertise of aviation's operational, business, and regulatory framework. And with that, let's give a warm welcome to Frederik. I'm thrilled to turn the stage over so he can share his perspective on the exciting developments associated with advanced air mobility, UAS, and RPAS, as well as the growing interoperability that's occurring on the global scale.
Thank you, Dr. Terwilliger. I'm very happy and honored to be here with you and to share a bit of background information on the activities of ICAO. So I will not go into much detail about what ICAO is, because that was part of the biographical details that you just read out. So ICAO is indeed the UN agency addressing the regulation, the global regulatory framework for aviation, but including unmanned aviation. So the presentation that will be given here is essentially focused on regulatory activities. There will be a bit of stuff on technical aspects, but mostly it's going to be a regulatory activity. So I'm going to now share my screen. I hope it is working. Excellent. Thank you for the thumbs up, Brent. Appreciate. So that is the first slide. I will go now into the meat and the overview of the presentation. I'll touch a little bit on terminology, because terminology is important for regulators, as we all know. I'll go into a quick reminder on the RPAS components, because RPAS is a system. Then a bit of background on ICAO's mandate in this space. We know ICAO has been at the forefront of the international regulation of aviation since 1944. But it's well known that that there are also activities in the specifically in the unmanned aviation arena. And then I'll touch on what ICAO is doing to support these operations, particularly in the area of standards development, and how ICAO is doing that, which is the work of the RPAS panel, which I'm supporting with my team in Montreal. A bit of explanation on advanced air mobility and how advanced air mobility fits into the big broader picture of our work program. And then I'll provide a bit of resources in case some of you want to get a bit more material or information on the ICAO's activities regarding unmanned aviation. So first, starting with terminology, and this is going to sound quite basic for many of you, but it's always a good reminder. What is there's sometimes some confusion between what is a UAS, what is an RPAS. Well, all these terms are inclusive of an aircraft, whether it is a remotely piloted aircraft or an unmanned aircraft. It is an unmanned aircraft, and under the foundational document of civil aviation, the Chicago Convention, an unmanned aircraft is an aircraft which is intended to be operated with no pilot on board. That's embodied in Annex 7. Annex 7 to the Chicago Convention. And an aircraft, as we know, is simply a machine which derives its support in the air through the reactions of the air, other than the reactions of the air against the Earth's surface. So most machines fitting that definition, whether they are deriving their lift from aerostatic reactions or aerodynamic, would essentially match that description. And most, we don't call them drones, but unmanned aircraft, because they do not have a pilot on board, are considered unmanned aircraft and match the definition that you have on the screen. Now, in terms of categorization, there are several big groups actually in unmanned aircraft. The first one on the bottom, it's quite simple. It's what is called unmanned balloons. Unmanned balloons are either free or managed. They are balloons, they are aircraft. Then you have the category called RPA here, remotely piloted aircraft. So a remotely piloted aircraft distinguishes itself from other unmanned aircraft by the fact that it is remotely piloted by a remote pilot who is managing the flight of the RPA from a remote pilot station. We'll get in a couple slides into the basic definitions of the component, but that's a key thing. So something that is flying in a way that can be considered as autonomous without any human intervention would not typically be considered as an RPA, but rather under the catch-all category of other UA. Now, from a regulatory perspective, you can see the outer circles here. the RPA corresponds to the certified category, essentially. And then you must be familiar with the three-tier operation-centric categorization scheme. So the open category is is the one that includes uses such as recreational uses or typically visual line of sight uses of UAS. Specific is the category where are most of the professional slash commercial uses. So while the open category is essentially left to domestic regulation, for which there's quite a light touch regulation, the specific category, because it entails a higher risk to third parties or parties on the ground, is usually subject to a risk assessment and subject to an authorization by the state where these operations take place. And the certified category is the closest regulatory framework that corresponds to commercial activities for conventional aviation, where you have a certificated aircraft, a licensed remote pilot, and an operator approved by a state of the operator. So that's just a little background on that. The components. So three main components for an RPAS. So one RPA, the flying machine. One RPS, so that's the remote pilot station, which is either on the ground or could be on another aircraft, or could be on a ship, could even be in space. It's a location that can be moved around. Quite often the link between the RPS and the RPA is what we call a C2 link, which is the data link between the RPA and the RPS to manage the flight. This C2 link is expected in many cases to be provided via different ground-based or satellite-based means, including satellite provision of the C2 link. There are also other components essential for the flight, for what is called RPAS, ATC communications and surveillance equipment, like ADS-B, for instance, or transponders or radio comms, other navigation equipment. But there are also quite RPAS specific equipments like launch and recovery equipment, flight control computer or FMS, autopilots that is expected to be part of the RPAS, as well as system health monitoring and flight termination systems. So in terms of regulation, I mentioned the three categories. You have them here actually in a bit more in a different way, in a more graphic way. So the certified category is the higher risk category. Why is it higher risk? Well, it's higher risk because the philosophy of RPAS is integration into conventional aviation. So these aircraft, because they're expected to conduct international operations, so cross-border operations, essentially in an IFR environment from controlled airports and in controlled airspace, they are expected to be integrated fully with conventional traffic. Hence the need for the most stringent regulatory complexity, and that is what is given through the ICAO annexes, the standards and recommended practices that ICAO develops through the RPAS panel to make sure that that RPAS comply with these most stringent requirements. For the specific category, it's a different animal. It's not regulated through standards yet, but through guidance material, ICAO has developed model regulations that are available on the ICAO freely on the website. And you also have the open category, which is the lower risk category, for which also guidance material is available. Just a bit of I can't resist. I'm a lawyer, so I like to cite articles. Apologies for that. But that is quite an important one. Article 8 of the Chicago Convention is the article that deals with pilotless aircraft. So that's the term that was used by the founders of the convention back in the at the end of World War II. And essentially what this says is that no pilotless aircraft shall be flown without a special authorization from the overflown state. That is a quite important principle. So there, which derives directly from the principle of sovereignty of airspace over states, and the flight of such pilotless aircraft shall be conducted so as to obviate, so avoid danger to civil aircraft. That is quite important. So also quite important to understand that all aircraft, whether manned or unmanned, engaged in international navigation should carry documents, the critical documents that all of us know about, and that every students on day one of the training gets used with: the certificate of registration, the certificate of airworthiness, and licenses for crew members. Because these 3 documents are listed in the convention to carry out international operations, they are also necessary for unmanned aircraft. So as a result, ICAO was given a mandate to develop standards specifically for unmanned aircraft, starting with remotely piloted aircraft, because of these provisions here. So, as we said, Article 29, which lists the documents needed for international navigation, the provisions, actually a new Annex 6 Part 4 is in the final stages of being developed in ICAO, establishing an RPAS operator certificate. There is a certificate of airworthiness also, exactly similar to conventional aircraft, manned aircraft. And for that, standards already exist and were adopted by ICAO in Annex 8, as well as a license. And there are already standards, ICAO standards, which establish what is called a remote pilot license, and provides the basis for the training and the licensing of remote pilots. So that is the framework. Now, what I'm just talking about here, and that explains the layered approach to ICAO's work, and a layered structure in how to approach this entire new entrant into aviation. So the first core here at the center is what we just said, is the key documents needed for international navigation. So you have here the license, the airworthiness certificate, and the RPAS operator certificate. Very linked to that is safety management. Safety management is integral to the approval of the operator. So that's part of, there are also Annex 19 requirements that apply to RPAS, as well as C tooling, and because an RPAS is a system, there also has to be requirements for C tooling, and those already exist. Now another layer, the second layer here is a set of additional requisites which are needed for the safe international navigation, and that includes detect and avoid provisions. Detect and avoid capabilities are needed, and standards are also necessary. Standards for ATM, air traffic management, as well as search and rescue. Provisions on aerodromes, Annex 14. How do you integrate RPAS into the aerodrome environment, mindful of the absence of a pilot on board? That's also something the ICAO is working on. Aeronautical information management is a corollary to that. And then you have a third layer, which is the external layer of enablers here that are also needed for international navigation, such as provisions for environment, noise or emissions certification that apply to conventional aircraft, also apply to unmanned aircraft. Legal considerations, of course, aviation security, as well as facilitation as well. These provisions apply to aircraft under the Chicago Convention, so they also should apply to unmanned aircraft, as well as other considerations such as funding and financing of aviation infrastructure, and even the exchange, bilateral or multilateral exchange of traffic rights from country A to country B. Eventually, in the short term, the expectation is that authorization will take place on a ad hoc bilateral basis between two countries willing to have RPAS traffic flying internationally between them. But eventually, when operations scale, it could be contemplated that more systematic arrangements are entered into. So that's the RPAS panel. It's a great group of people. These are the experts who are relentlessly developing the standards, what we call the SARPs, standards and recommended practices, as well as guidance material in many different areas of work. So airworthiness, operations, licensing, C2 detect and avoid, human in the system, aerodromes, safety management, and so on and so forth. So the RPAS panel is a technical expert group that brings together regulators and industry. That's how that's typically the way ICAO works. Bring together these stakeholders, typically also from all 6 regions, in order to ensure geographical representation, with major industry stakeholders like the typical conventional aviation stakeholders like the airlines, the airports, the ANSPs, as well as a representative from pilots, air traffic controllers, as well as also as much as possible representatives of the nascent unmanned aviation industry. So that's the process for developing SARPs. I'm not going to expand too much on that. It's you have this graph here. Developing standards and recommended practices is a collegial process which involves different stages. The Air Navigation Commission is the stakeholder which reviews the standards before they are sent out to states for consultation, and then they come back for another review by the Air Navigation Commission, and then they're adopted by the what is called the ICAO Council, and then they become law. Well, they become standards. They become mandatory for all states at what is called the applicability date. So this is a graph I like to show to basically make a key distinction. You have the upper half of the graph here is dedicated to international. So international is the upper, domestic is the lower, And on the left, you have the high risk certified category, whereas the right half is the medium low risk category of operation. So in the upper left quadrant, quadrant 1 here is typically the scope of the RPAS panel. This is what is needed for the high risk integrated into conventional aviation and international. So that's typically the SARPs, the standard and recommended practices that ICAO develops through the RPAS panel. Now, there are also international operations, but which do not necessarily require the full ambit of and the full might of these highly stringent requirements here. And those are operations, for instance, cross-border operations, but using UAS, BVLOS type operations, um, or operations on the high seas with UAS. So this quadrant 2 is also something that ICAO is working on now. On the bottom, you have the domestic. So the domestic high risk would probably correspond to the riskier, let's say, operations using UAS, but in a more risky environment, in due course and after due consideration for safety, involving overflight over people, for which it's quite likely that regulators will demand a level of stringency quite similar to international high risk. In this category may also fall eventually what is referred to under the advanced air mobility eVTOL passenger transporting use cases. I say in due course because, as we know, in the initial stages, at least, a licensed pilot is expected to be on board. So eventually, that might be the case. And the domestic medium risk is domestic operation, domestic regulations for recreational or lower risk use cases. And advanced air mobility in that framework, well, it's probably touching a bit of everything because it can include international operations of a higher risk, but also the UAS BVLOS type operations could include the flying taxi with people as well as the smaller UAS in this quadrant here. So that is a slide which I like because it illustrates that advanced air mobility is a relative concept. It's in aviation we like to have, I mean, we have absolute concepts since the beginning. It's, you know, you're dealing with aerodromes, or you're dealing with airworthiness, or you're dealing with air traffic management. These are tangible, stable things, but advanced is a qualifier. What is advanced today may not be tomorrow, and so it's a bit tricky to pinpoint exactly where it starts and where it ends. A bit of resources just for if you are curious about exploring a bit more on ICAO's activities for international UAS or RPAS. I'm not going to read through them, but there is a useful link here with the webinar series. You can access these different webinars for free with different UAS operations, as well as the model regulations that ICAO has developed. There's stuff about the UTM framework, U8 also, humanitarian operations. So I hear there's a strong interest for disaster relief or medical operations, or support for emergency response. Well, there is guidance that exists in ICAO. You can find it here. SMS for US operations, for instance, also could be an interesting resource. There are courses that were developed, an overview of unmanned aviation fundamentals, unmanned aircraft systems operations, and UAS regulations, as well as a particular course on safety management systems. That's the unmanned aviation fundamentals. So it's geared towards the regulators, mid-level regulators who are considering developing regulations or implementing them, and it's a 5-day class. Also to note is what we call the implementation packages. That's more a tool to assist states. It was established quite recently during the pandemic, but it's a package of tools to help states develop or implement unmanned aviation regulations. So that's something I already showed. We have our drone enable symposium coming up shortly, 5 to 7 December in Montreal, and the theme this year is innovation and infrastructure developments supporting the future of unmanned aviation. These are also available online after the event. And that concludes my presentation. I hope it wasn't too long. So that's it. Thanks. And back to you, Brent.
That was outstanding. Thank you, Frederik. So I'm going to lead off with a few questions. What are some of the unique challenges you see right now in uncrewed aviation? What are the pressing issues that are being pushed to the highest priority within the RPAS panel for ICAO?
Thanks for the question. So quite clearly the focus is really threefold. First, I would say ATM integration. So we now have the fundamental building blocks. There is a remote pilot license. There is a framework for that. There is a framework for the certificate of airworthiness. There's a framework for the granting of a RPAS operator certificate. So now the focus is integration into the airspace, so air traffic management. And that comes with its set of complexities. As we know, the RPAS, the system, includes a C2 link, which is a data link, which is a radio link, essentially. And radio has its limitations. Sometimes its flaws. Sometimes it can be interrupted. Sometimes the quality of the signal is degraded. And there needs to be procedures to make sure that if that happens, the aircraft behaves in a safe way, meaning in a predictable way, predictable by essentially by air traffic control. Because as I mentioned, the entire tenet of RPAS is integration in international IFR controlled airspace. So that's what the RPAS panel has been working on significantly, to develop procedures to ensure that the RPA has a way to broadcast the state of lost C2 link through a specific transponder code, and that there are procedures a little bit like what exists for the lost comms procedures that we know of in conventional aviation. If you lost comm, you you should proceed on course for a number of minutes and then climb to a certain altitude after X number of minutes, especially if you are on a standard instrument departure or a star. Well, it's the same philosophy essentially. It's to make sure that the aircraft is predictable, and that's something that is pre-programmed. Detect and avoid is another important activity. Finding ways to compensate for the fact that there is no pair of eyeballs in the cockpits to look outside, at least in VMC, but also that there is the capability of the aircraft, in case it loses its C2 link, to perform automated maneuvers to avoid other traffic. That these capabilities already exist for conventional aviation, but the challenge comes from integrating that into the airspace, mindful that there is no pilot on board, which is a key feature of RPAS. So I would say these are the main challenges, and there will be others, and there will be also challenges that we don't know of now, but that will be discovered as the work progresses, for sure.
Excellent. So standards provide that essential framework for the establishment of functional expectations, use strategies, and even government regulations. On that front, I've got just a couple questions that tie to that. Do you see some further movement towards UAS operator certificate or license reciprocity, such as what we already have with radio communications? Do you see more movement in occurrence on that front?
By reciprocity, you mean reciprocity between countries?
Yeah, where, for example, if I have a Part 107 certificate here in the United States, taking that abroad to other ICAO member states, and in the same way that you might see that for other licenses.
Well, that's a very good question. The approach that was taken by ICAO is an organization that is composed of 193 member states, and the consensus was to focus on the higher risk category. So the certificated RPA, the licensed remote pilots, and the approved operator under Annex 6. So that's the approach that was taken. There is no yet consensus to develop standards for the smaller UAS, non RPAS typically, and that is a result of the fact that different states may have different requirements, and different airspaces, different ways to regulate, and there is a lot of activity in this field. The RPAS space is quite important because it's cross-border, and it's high risk. However, a strong majority of the business cases is probably represented in the specific category. Meaning UAS, and for those, there is no consensus yet to develop standards for those.
Excellent. And in follow-up to that, I do want to ask, what ways might students consider getting involved with standards review and development groups, such as the ICAO RPAS community, are there ways that they could start to consider to support panel research as volunteers or even serving as representatives of their employers?
Well, thanks for that. It is quite timely question, because we do have the first Advanced Air Mobility Symposium taking place next year. Sorry, and as a lead up to this symposium is an initiative, a call for academic papers, which is precisely aimed at collecting and engaging high quality research and other research activities to give the possibility for new ideas and new construct to emerge. So that is a channel which we use to generate that kind of input. There will be a call for academic papers. I'll be happy to coordinate with you, Brent. Maybe if I when this evolves, or when we have a more details in the lead up to the symposium. Symposium is planned for 9 to 12 September next year, 24.
Outstanding. Well, first we'll go to George. I believe you had your hand raised.
Hey, good evening, Dr. T. Thanks for putting another session on. This is great. And Frederik, thank you for giving us your time and the presentation you've given us so far. So I want to touch on advanced air mobility, because this is something that I think Dr. T has come to recognize. It's a pet project of mine to try and learn as much as I can about it. One of the questions I have about ICAO is how does a company, and for instance, I'll use Archer, because it's a company that I've done a lot of research on here recently. How does a company like Archer, who puts together an airframe with the plans of having it initially manned and then moving into the future, making it an unmanned platform, as they work with the FAA to certify their aircraft, how does that translate over to the ICAO and certifying the aircraft within the ICAO? Is there, much like what Dr. T said, is there a reciprocal relationship between the two organizations to say, okay, you've already gone through this process with the FAA. We know this is what their line of standards are. Are there additional standards that they have to meet to be certified inside of the ICAO?
Thanks, and it's a very good question. And first, ICAO doesn't issue certificates. ICAO doesn't issue licenses. It doesn't issue certificates of competencies, and it doesn't even issue regulations. It's quite important. It is the role of ICAO is to develop standards based on consensus. So what really happens is that it usually starts in particular countries. In countries, you have developments, states adopt regulations to address operations. And after a while, when these operations are deemed safe and the regulations are considered appropriate, typically states get together and exchange on their best practices. That's a typical process, and that's how the standards then are generated from these best practices. States say, okay, that has worked in my country, and then another state say, oh yeah, okay, that works fine, but I would tweak that aspect, and then they establish a block of requirements that are considered acceptable to everyone. Now, and that's typically the way it has worked for aviation. Sometimes there's a need to have a standard before the fact for emergency reasons. For instance, say there's a need to have a new tracking device to locate an airplane quite rapidly because of recent events, then there is this kind of authority to develop something which applies to all countries, and that is something quite new. Now, in advanced air mobility, we're dealing with an ecosystem which is quite a different animal from the typical operations there. And it goes beyond the traditional segmentations of aviation activities based on risk, based on weight and number of passengers, for instance, because that doesn't apply because there's typically no one on board for UAS. There is expected to be people in the long run for advanced air mobility, granted. There is also a fragmentation of stakeholders. In aviation, you typically have well-established players, the airlines, the ANSPs, the airports. They are kind of represented in organizations that offer a consolidated voice that doesn't exist yet. It's advanced air mobility is considered as an ecosystem. If you look at various definitions of what is AAM around the world, you will see different kind of definitions, all involving an ecosystem of some sort, which is something that is broader than the neat categories that we have in aviation. All that to say that it's still work in progress. The work of ICAO is now at a stage where it on AAM it consists in scoping and mapping out the concepts, understanding what can be a gap analysis from existing provisions, and in due course, states will develop will authorize operations on a gradual basis, and eventually, after a while, standards will be needed in order for instance, manufacturers to be able to sell products in various countries. So it's gonna be a gradual process, I believe.
Awesome. Thank you very much for the great reply. I appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you.
Brendan, do you still have a question?
No, I do not. My question got answered during that because I was going to ask about BV loss and how you guys would be going through that process of currently in the U.S. so many people are trying to get BV loss, and how the regulations and standards will be made, and you guys don't make the regulations as you said, and you said standards. You wait, the countries come together and work together to come up with it. So my question got answered in the middle of that.
Excellent. Stacia, any questions? No. Oh, okay. Let's see. Into the chat. This might be along the same lines. You mentioned procedures similar to being Nordo for losing C2 before. What are other considerations that are going into regulating and planning for emergency mission contingency operations for international civilian RPAS flights in the event of lost link scenarios. Do you see them being filed similar to flight plans?
Yeah, the same principles and constructs apply to RPAS. So typically, the filing of an IFR flight plan is expected to be the norm, exactly similar to any IFR cross-border operation. A flight plan needs to be filed with ATC. With a few specifics. For instance, the qualifier that the aircraft is unmanned, and during the operational pre-flight phase, it's expected also that the operator would ensure that the steps have been taken to pre-program correctly the RPAS in case of a contingency, of typically a C2 link loss. The aircraft is expected to be able to first broadcast a particular transponder code to alert ATC, but also to fly pre-programmed procedures. And these procedures need to be acceptable by the state, by the country in which the airspace is in which airspace the operation is taking place. So these are mitigations that are expected to be included. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, as well as a major thank you to Frederik for sharing his thoughts and expertise regarding this technology. It's been a very informative session that helps us to better understand the challenges that are associated with international standards development within the aerial domain. I hope to have the recording from this session uploaded to the Instructor Corner by tomorrow, and I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Brent.
Thank you.